I want to welcome all of our visitors here this morning. It's great having you here. 2 weeks ago, when I was preaching over in Kashmir, I made two statements. One was that I could not believe, with them being closer to the Cascades than we were, that spring had already sprung over there. We were driving through Wenatchee, Kashmir, and Leavenworth, and the trees were already blooming, bushes were full of buds and flowers, the tulips and daffodils or whatever were popping up. And I told him that over here, Thursday and Friday, we were still having snow, and it was just crazy. But it was wonderful yesterday. I'm sure everybody enjoyed the 80-degree weather and the warm sunshine. And on your way here this morning, you should have noticed that we have all kind of trees blooming now. So spring has finally sprung here. And the other thing I mentioned to them that, it was great seeing everybody there. We hadn't seen them in over 20 years. But it's been nice having Kashmir coming here all the time and visiting. And it was always wonderful to see everybody that comes over. And the same is true this morning. We have a couple with us that came from Kashmir. They've moved now to the other side of the mountain, but we still consider them family from Kashmir. So it's great having them here. This morning, I want us to go into Biblical History 101 and just look at a few things dealing with our history as Christians and the things that we read in the Bible. I'm sure everybody is well familiar with archaeology, biblical archaeology that's constantly going on over in the Bible lands, and they're constantly looking for items. And one of the probably biggest discoveries they've ever made was the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is in the Qumran or Qumran caves that you see up there on the top right. I saw a documentary about these, and there are hundreds of caves scattered around this area, and they're still finding caves today. Some of them have caved in, and they're having to excavate them, and they're going in and finding more Dead Sea Scrolls. And for those of you who are not familiarized, whenever Rome was captured, all of the scribes took off and left Rome, and they took all of their work with them. And they went to this area and finished what they were doing, and that was transcribing the scriptures onto these scrolls and putting them into the clay pots that you see, and then hiding them in these caves so they would not be captured. And we had an opportunity one time when we were down in Oklahoma. There was a member of the church there who was actually working on the Dead Sea Scrolls that you see here in this bottom right, and going through the interpretation or translation of the scrolls. And he made the comment that things, these were written hundreds of years ago, centuries ago, and they have not found any differences in the Bible that we have today and these scrolls. And as we talked about last week, there are some translations, as we looked at last week, that do not include everything. And so that's the reason you need to be careful with the versions that you use. He said that the only section that they have found that was different was in Isaiah, and I think it was 119, the longest chapter. There was a section towards the front, I want to say around verses 5 through 7 or something like that, that did not really flow good. And he said when they were doing these inscriptions and everything in Psalm, that they found those, if I can say, missing 5 or 6 scriptures from that. And I don't know if those will ever make their way into the Bible or not, but he says that was the only difference that they had ever found in the inscriptions from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But again, that was a huge archaeological discovery made through that. When I was preaching in Kashmir, I brought up the idea around 2002, this box was found. It's a burial box that they would put bones into, and this was called the Jesus box. And inscribed on it, you can barely see it on the side, it was the burial box of James, the brother of Jesus. And that was the reason they called it the Jesus box. And it was a big thing and everything. And they carbon dated it, and it carbon dated to that time period. And, it was a big thing because it actually listed the name of Jesus on the side. Well, they started doing more research, and they found out that when they scraped past the outer coating and got to the inner coating, the inner construction of it, that dated more common, more recent than biblical times, 2,000 years ago. And they found out that it was a fake, and that whoever had created it had taken items from that era, ground it up into a fine powder, and had put it on the outside of this box. When researching this, I've read it, and they said that the guy who found the box was actually, they did not find him of forgery. They said that he bought it from somebody else, and that they had probably forged it, and so he was not found guilty. Another item that you might be more familiar with is what they call the Shroud of Turin. This is something that was held in the Catholics for so long, and it's supposed to be the burial cloth of Jesus. And this is only the front side of it. It's actually longer, and it actually shows a front and a back imprint of a man. You can see him head here and his feet down that way. But they said that this was laid over the body of Jesus, and that whenever he entered back into his body to rise, that he left an imprint on the cloth. And so this is supposed to be the burial cloth of Jesus. And it was a big thing, and being toured around and in museums and everything else. Well, the Catholic Church finally allowed them to do some carbon dating on it, and they found out that the cloth was 2,000 years old, not 2,000 years old, but not real old. And they said, well, that was probably where they had mended the cloth to make it complete. Well, if you could see right here where his hand is crossed, there is supposedly a blood stain. And they checked that, and it wasn't blood, it was paint. And so through other testings of this shroud, they have claimed that it is not authentic. Okay? And I have stated this before, is I don't think that we will ever find any. Yes, we're going to find biblical artifacts as far as towns and things like that, but we're not going to find any large archaeological find like just major items like the Ark of the Covenant, because our faith, as Hebrews 11:1 states, is by faith. Our faith is on things that are not seen, that we can't lay our hands on, that are tangent. And so for that reason, I don't think we're ever going to find any real major biblical archaeological finds because of that. Otherwise, we're going to have something that we can put our hands on, that we can touch, and you say, okay, now I have faith. Now I believe in God. I believe in the Bible because there's something that I can touch, that I can see. And because of that, I don't think we'll ever find anything like that. I want us to look at this timeline of the years before the death of Christ. This is the time known as BC, which is before Christ. That calendar ended at Christ's birth, not his death. You will notice that this calendar actually goes down to his death, which is wrong. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But you'll notice that the years show in the Garden of Eden at 4000 BC, before Christ, and the numbers go down to what's supposed to be the birth of Christ, and then it starts with AD, which is the time frame we live in, which the AD stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord, not after death, which most people misquote that as meaning. And that's where they come up with the cross, is because AD is after death. BC is before Christ. Well, no, it's not. The time difference started at Christ's birth. BC being before Christ, and AD being after Christ, after he was raised. So we want to make sure that we get that right. But again, there are a lot of controversies on the internet as to what these mean and the time frames of them. I saw one thing that said that Christ was born in 4 BC. Well, that can't be if BC stands for before Christ. He can't be at 4 BC. Okay? So again, we need to be careful of what we're reading on in the internet. We need to make sure that they are correct. So as we see here, 4000 BC at the Garden of Eden, that puts the beginning of time only, 6,023-ish years ago? Not the millions of years that we see in science. You know, science says that the earth is 45 million years old or a billion years old or whatever, but they have to do that in order to allow evolution to make sense, because in order for things to evolve, it can't just happen in 6,000 years. It's had to happen millions of years to get to where it was at this time frame. Okay? And they do that by carbon dating. And they are finding out, surprised if you might be, that carbon dating is not correct. You know, what they have used for carbon dating to get that 45 million years date is not true. And again, science over and over and over again is proving the Bible correct, not wrong. And they keep trying to use science to prove the Bible wrong, and they have to stop because, again, it is proving the Bible correct. And we'll come back to this in a minute. I want to go to this chart here. The black line that you see is the flood, and you should recognize the stuff to the left because we talked about that when we talked about the flood. It starts off with Adam, and across the chart it starts at 0, being the beginning of time, not BC where it's going backwards. And it's doing that because of showing the years. And we see Adam living 930 years. Seth, 1,043 years. You know, that's just crazy, isn't it? Or, excuse me, I'm sorry, that was the year he died. He lived 912 years. But we see here how long they were living up until the flood, except for Noah. Noah lived 950 years. But after the flood, we see how their years decreased. After that, we see them living, 400 years, and then 200 and something years, and then starting about Abraham doing 100 and something years. Okay, and then Jacob down there living 147 years. So we see here how the time has decreased, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Up here in this white box, it says Genesis 47, 8 through 9. And I want to read what it says there. It says, this exchange, talking about Genesis 47, 8 through 9, this exchange between Jacob and Pharaoh should take on a new meaning once you realize that Jacob understood that many of his ancestors lived much longer than his recent ancestors did. In fact, once you realize on this chart that Jacob's great, that's 9 greats, grandfather, Shem, could have held Jacob on his knee as a baby, the verses in Genesis 47 should take on more of a meaning. In fact, if you look at this closer and you look at Shem coming out here, he lived out to this, like I said, this year here, at 2106 or 2108. Okay? When you come down here to Jacob, he lived at 2258. So there's actually 50 years that Shem was alive, that Jacob was alive. So not only could Shem have held him as a baby, he would have known him for 50 years. Imagine that. 10 generations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations back, being able to know your grandfather. No other time in history could that have been done. Genesis 47, 8 through 9. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. And they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." As we just saw in that timeline, how old they were living before the flood, which is part of Jacob's lineage, compared to what he was living that day. If you want to see more of a detailed timeline, when you go through the door into the fellowship hall on the left-hand wall, you will find this chart. And I see this advertised quite a bit on the internet, but it's a very detailed history map and lineage of a lot of people. So if you want to see that, that is in the back, and you can buy them online. I'm going to go back to this chart again, showing the timeline from the beginning to the death of Christ. If you'll notice there, the flood was the year 2294, supposedly, close enough. Okay, and then the Tower of Babel was 2250, which is only 44 years between the flood and the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, which we will read here in a few minutes, is only 12 verses long. Not a big story or a great battle. And there are no big names associated with the Tower of Babel. But the Tower of Babel story had a huge impact on the world thereafter. Most cultures have a story of a great world flood. The story behind the flood is not correct, but they do record a great flood in their history. You will notice below each of these pictures the time frame of BCE or BC. CE, and then down here BCE. And what that represents is Common Era. This represents Common Era, and this is before the Common Era. And what this is used for is for non-Christians. They don't want to use the BC and AD referring to Christ, so they use the CE or BCE as a common era, but it still zeroes out at the birth of Christ. Okay? So that's just another way that they tell time without having to use before Christ. Now we see here, 15 different cultures of the world and the idea of a flood in those cultures. We have the Incas, the Aztecs with the flood of Coxcox, the Norse with the fall of Ymir, the Hopi, some of these I've never heard of before, the Hawaiians, they have a history of a great flood. The Yoruba, the Greek, the Judaism, of course, which is what we fall under with the Noah's Ark, Babylonian, Hindu. I want you to notice that theirs is people being carried on a boat that is being guided by a large fish. The Chinese, the Kun and the flood. Egyptians going forth by day. The Sumerian, the Aboriginal with the Rainmaker. They even have a history of a flood in their history. And then Adam and Eve, which I've never heard of, which was a punishment. But we see these 15 cultures, and there's others out there, that have a great flood in their distant history. And like I said, even though it's not scriptural the way they explain it, like you see the Hindu with the fish, but it is a great flood. And I showed it to you a couple of years ago with the archaeologists when they have dug down and looked at the different layers of the soil. They have come up with a layer that is animals and fish and humans and all bones together, and they can't explain it. The flood explains it. They've gone up to high mountaintops and have found fish fossils, and they can't explain it. The flood explains it. Okay? Again, go back to Bible, not science. Here is a map that I wanted you to understand. This is the Mediterranean Sea, the Bible lands. There's Jerusalem. This is the Persian Gulf, which I think that's the lower sea, which I guess Caspian Sea, that's the lower sea. But we have Babylonia, and right there is where they think that the Tower of Babel was. And then I also want to point out Mount Ararat up here to where the Ark of Noah was at. Okay, and then the next map, I want to show a larger area of Asia. Here again, we have the Mediterranean Sea, the Persian Gulf, where the Tower of Babel was. And if we go straight across through China, we have Korea and Japan over there. And those will become important here in just a few minutes. I hate when I fat finger things. Start in Genesis 10, describes the genealogy of Noah. And then we drop down to the last verse, verse 32. It says, "These were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations, in their nations, and from these, the sons of Noah, the nations were divided on the earth after the flood." Going into chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. "Now the whole earth had one language and one speech." Of course, coming from Noah and his children, they would all have the same language. "And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there, that they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth.'" Now let's stop here a minute and do a quick review. Chapter 10, verse 32 stated that the descendants of Noah would form the nations of the world. Verse 1 of this chapter states that they journeyed from the east to the land of Shinar. They dwelt there, and this gives indication that they are the Noah's descendants, and that they stopped here on their way around the world, but they decided to build a city there. And, of course, the tower into the heavens and make a name for themselves, which they did succeed at doing. They did make a name for themselves. These scriptures don't state that they were the Noah's descendants, or that it was some of them. But who else could it be? But it had to be some form of their descendants. But it gives, to me, the indication that it was Noah's descendants who were supposed to go abroad, but they decided not to. Verse 5, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, 'Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language.' And this is what they began to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Nothing that these people with one language propose to do will be withheld from them. They will be able to accomplish great feats and do anything that they want to do." So this us came down. Who is this us? It doesn't state. Was it the Lord who spoke it, or was it God? We don't know. Was the us God and Jesus, or was it just the Jesus and the angels? Again, we don't know. All we do know is that the us came down and confused their language. That is all the different languages of the world: German, French, Italian, Russian, English, Chinese, Indian, maybe even more. You know, there are 150 to 200 different languages today on this world. And some of those come from different Englishes or different languages, and they transform, okay? But the point is that all the languages of today, all the different languages, came from the Tower of Babel. Verse 8, "So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over all the face of the earth. So after the Lord divided their languages, he continued with what he stated back in Genesis 10:32 by scattering the descendants of Noah across the earth. Up to recently, there were no other stories of the Tower of Babel in any other cultures like the story of the flood to sort of collaborate this story. This past week, I received an email from the Apologetics Press with a story about the Tower of Babel. The Apologetics Press is a Church of Christ-based organization that creates scripturally and sound and scientifically accurate materials in the field of Christian apologetics. And I want to share with you this morning some inserts from that article. This can be found on the Apologetics Press website. This article in the Apologetics Press was written by Dave Miller, who Kathy and I met a couple of years ago when we went down to the lectureships at the Linder Road Church of Christ in Meridian, Idaho. This article was written in 2018, and I quote, "The Bible possesses the attributes of divine inspiration with significant internal evidence to establish its divine origin. Hence, when it relates to a historical incident that occurred thousands of years ago, one would naturally expect that such an incident might well be noted in other historical accounts from antiquity. Of course, one would not expect all or even many of the details to match exactly for at least two reasons. Number one being that the oral transmission of history is inevitably subject to human frailty, including both accuracy and memory and temptation to embellish. Have you ever played that game called Gossip? We get it in a circle. We did this, I remember, in high school. And the teacher will tell somebody a phrase. And you can only repeat it once. And that person is to turn to the next person and repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it, and all the way around, and to see what they say at the end. And a lot of times the person will look at him and go, "What?" But they can't repeat it, and so he'll repeat something that's totally different than what was originally started. Okay? And that's what they're referring to here, that when things are just transferred down through history by oral story, things get changed or things get embellished. Oh, that's boring, so let's embellish it. Let's make it a bigger fight or a bigger battle than what it was. Number two, false religion has a tendency to distort and recast history in order to suit its own purposes and achieve its own agenda. And we saw that with the Indian interpretation of the flood, that it went to a large fish carrying the boat across the water. Again, bringing up what they wanted to say. An excellent example of these tendencies is seen in the multiplicity of and variety in the multitude of accounts of the great flood of Noah's day. Though they differ widely from culture to culture, from country to country, and century to century, nevertheless, they share substantial agreement in too many significant features not to have risen from the same historical factual event. And that's what they're saying. The 15 that we looked at about the flood differ greatly, but they have one thing in common. There was a flood that encircled the whole world. Okay? Going on with this story, in 1653, a Dutch ship called the Sparrowhawk was carrying a group of wayfaring Dutchmen on a journey to Japan. The ship was shipwrecked on an island off the coast of South Korea. The 36 survivors were taken into custody by the local prefect and were transferred to the capital of Seoul, where they spent the next 13 years. In September of 1666, 8 survivors managed to escape to Japan. One of the survivors, Hendrik Hamel, spent the ensuing years in Nagasaki, writing an account of his observations and experience in Korea, which was published in 1668. This was the first Western account of a first-hand description of Korean society and culture. The journal was only recently translated In his journal, Hamill gives a fascinating experiences and assessment of Korean life in the 17th century, their religious life, including the customs and practices of Confucianism. At one point of the journal, Hammond makes a passing remark concerning the beliefs held by the Confucian monks, stating that many monks believe that long ago all people spoke the same language. But when people built a tower in order to climb into heaven, the whole world changed. Sound familiar? Observe that the belief of the non-Christian monks regarding the Tower of Babel contained 4 salient points that explicitly and directly connect with the biblical account. Number 1, the entire world's population spoke a single language. Number 2, the people constructed a tower. Number 3, their stated goal was to climb into heaven. And number 4, their efforts affected the entire world. We just read about these 4 points in Genesis 11, verses 1 through 11. Christianity and the Bible have nothing to fear from the unbelief, from the skepticism and hostility of infidelity. The more information that surfaces from history and nature, the more the Bible is confirmed in its uncanny accuracy and supernatural endowment. Brothers and sisters, non-believers have tried since the Jews during the time of Jesus to disprove Jesus. Heaven and the Bible, once it was written, they can't do it. The Bible is true and accurate. Science can't disprove the Bible. All that science does is prove that the Bible is true and accurate. Many a person have decided that they were going to do something that nobody else has been able to do, and they sit down with the Bible and they start in Genesis with a piece of paper, and they're going to write down all the inaccuracies of the Bible and prove that it doesn't exist. We know John Clayton has done this. And when he got finished reading through Revelations, he looked at his paper, his pad was empty. I read it too fast. So he goes back and reads it again. Closes the book, and his pad is still empty. And instead of proving that the Bible was wrong, instead of proving that the Bible was inaccurate, instead of proving that there were contradictions in the Bible, nobody has been able to do that. Instead, they prove to themselves that the Bible is true. And they become a Christian. You know, doesn't the Lord work in mysterious ways? We have no fear in the Bible being wrong. Like I said, it is being proved correct time and time again. Science, in trying to prove the Bible wrong, just proves that it's correct time and time again. That was one thing that we learned down at that lectureship, was how the Big Bang Theory is no longer taught. That all these professors that had their names on the Big Bang Theory have taken their names away from it. Nobody with any accreditation will back the Big Bang Theory, because the Big Bang Theory, through science, has been proven wrong. Because there had to be a substance that banged. And when they were asked, well, what was that substance that was banged? Who created it? Well, they couldn't say God, and so they pulled away from it because they realized it was false. And it's true with anything. Evolution, like I said, they keep saying, millions and millions of years that this earth has been around, but yet carbon dating is proving that wrong. So at some point, I suspect they'll pull away from that. Once they come out and realize and just say carbon dating is wrong. Brothers and sisters, what we believe in is the truth. What we believe in is fact. What we believe in is God, and He does exist. Don't ever doubt that. I know we all have at some point, probably. But God is alive, and He is alive in us. If there's any way that we can help you this morning, let us know. Let us help you. Let us pray for you. If you need to be baptized, our baptistry is ready. Please let your wishes be known as together we stand and sing.